Hey guys, Coach Lou, and as promised, this video is going to be based on binge eating, a term I come across often in my line of work. I'm a massive believer that the mind and the body very much come together. There's lots of proven studies. You'll see as I go through this video how it very much the two come together, and I always find it quite surprising that generally professionals work in one or the other. They work on the mind side and lack the knowledge on the nutritional and the health side, or they work on the health side and lack the knowledge on the mind. And I always find that really interesting because the two very much interconnect, and they certainly do within my two jobs of psychotherapy and as a transformation coach. Now, as a transformation coach, I'm very much working in depth on nutrition. I've got a lot of knowledge on nutrition, and it's actually the reason why I decided to go and look into the mental health side of things, because the two very much interlink, and I wanted to be able to be very specific and effective on both sides. So binge eating is a relatively new term. We came across it in about the 1950s. It was a guy called Albert Concord, I think I pronounced that right, and this was around about the time where basically if you had an eating disorder, it was put into categories of the likes of anorexia or bulimia nervosa, and at that time he tried to say, well, actually this is a condition as well, but it was really the 80s before it was starting to take notice. So before that, if you didn't fit those categories, you weren't classed as having an eating disorder. And as we're going through time, we're really starting to take notice of the change. And as a transformation coach, I get to see on a daily basis how the change in diet and processed foods and lifestyle have really caused us to become more of a problem. So one thing to note when it comes to binge eating, emotional eating, if you're a secret eater, it's more prevalent across the sexes compared to the other ones. So generally we always think of women. Binge eating is more prevalent among the sexes. Generally it comes generally people tend to find they start doing it about teenage age, early adult age, and it's something that can become quite a problem, and it's something when people joke about, I get really passionate about, because it's not something to joke about, because you're still abusing your body. Now generally binge eating, you do it because you're seeking some comfort or some pleasure, and that pleasure tends to only last a few moments, and once the binge is over, you tend to have feelings of guilt, shame, and some people, they're completely disgusted in themselves and what they've done. Now for some people, binge eating can really become problematic and can really ruin their life and cause them just to feel absolutely awful. And I feel now, because we've got the use of the internet, a lot of mental health problems can be thrown about like they're nothing, and you know, people make jokes about them, but in actual reality, if someone's suffering really badly from it, it can ruin their life, although there's lots of degrees. So I want to talk to you in this video really in depth as much as I can without making it go on too long, because there's so much I can talk to you about on recognising the signs, and then maybe looking at what you can do to help yourself combat it. You'll see me maybe looking to the side occasionally, because I've made a lot of notes as to what I want to talk about, because the area is so vast. It's an area I'm very passionate about. As some of you all know, I was in the dance industry for a long time. I was a competitive dancer as well, and eating disorders was something I came across a lot, and I learned a lot through the years about it. And funnily enough, I've came back to the nutritional side of things and the mental side of things, and that's why. So hopefully this video will really help some of you, because at the end of the day, you're doing something for pleasure, knowing fine well that at the end of the day, you're probably not going to feel like that after you've had the binge. Quite often there's a lot of agitation around it. Some people are known to pace a lot or to distract themselves. You might sit in front of the TV or read a magazine and distract yourself. Being secretive is a massive part of binge eating. We joke sometimes that we eat chocolate behind our kids' backs, but often binge eaters do this behind the partner's backs because they don't want people to know. And generally there's actually evidence to show that generally it often happens in the kitchen and the living room, and usually often when you're alone. Loneliness and boredom can be something that can be a factor, and I'm going to talk to you about how you can maybe combat that. So the main thing to think about though is there may not be one specific cause you can find at the moment, but as we go through this, hopefully it'll make some more sense to you. Because what I want to talk to you next is about the general feelings that usually come alongside binge eating. So one of the important things to remember, a common trait among people who binge eat, is how they feel about themselves. It's commonly linked to those people who have low self-esteem, low confidence in themselves, who generally struggle with having value over themselves or any self-worth. There's actually quite large links to perfectionism as well. Now, perfectionism can have its plus sides, and I like to remind people that because I'm a bit of a perfectionist myself. But there are plus sides to being perfectionist. However, the reason there's links to it is because sometimes it can be very much linked to unrelenting standards of yourself. So they're so high that it's impossible for you to complete something, and therefore when you fail, binge eating becomes the punishment. But basically, the main concepts here is the low self-esteem, the no confidence, the no value in yourself. And this is why I'm very prevalent on when I'm working with clients and building their confidence and their self-esteem. Now, there's also another link here, because generally, these come with core values that we have in ourselves, and these are often linked to our childhood, and something I quite often do, and it's very much something I do as a cognitive behavioural therapist, but is to find out, when was the first time you had these feelings about yourself, of this inadequacy you've got about yourself, and also when was the first time you remember creating these behaviours. What was it that triggered it? Now that means the feelings and the triggers can still be different, but generally the feelings that are associated around binge eating are you've got stress. Stress is a main trigger for a lot of people. I hear this all the time. People have had a bad week at work, they're majorly stressed, they go home and they've ate everything in sight. Tension, which is very similar. People who are lonely, depression, there's high links to depression and binge eating. Again, if you look at these aspects I'm talking about, like of depression, generally with depression and anxiety as well, the common characteristics are low self-esteem around it. So hopefully you're seeing how your feelings and your food here are starting to interlink. Now, generally, you don't hear people saying that they binge eat on a pot of vegetables. Yeah, and this is where my two jobs very much interlink. Generally, binge eating is very consistent with bad foods, as we'd call, or forbidden foods, as some people like to call it, and those are those sugary processed foods. And I'm not talking about sugars, natural sugars, I'm talking about processed foods that cause us to crave, that they cause our hormone levels, like some of our leptin levels, etc., to go crazy, which means the rest of our hormones and vital parts in our body go crazy, and is one of the reasons why we end up craving the sugar. And you can see why, if you've got a craving and you're already not feeling good about yourself, how it's going to be quite easy for you to reach for that bag of crisps or that chocolate. Now, when I'm talking about binge eating, it can be really prevalent in that it's not just something you do steal a bar of chocolate and that's you. It can be as serious as you're doing it over an evening. In fact, evening binge eating's very common. It could be you're in the kitchen cooking with the door shut, the rest of the family's doing their thing, and you're munching away as fast as you can. So there's various degrees and variations of it. So though you may be thinking, I don't do it that often, just because you don't do it that often doesn't mean you're not doing it, and doesn't mean that there's links there for you. But the thing to remember, the main thing to remember is it's a self-sabotage, and it's very much linked to this lack of love for yourself. There's something there that makes you self-punish by eating yourself into a bad mood, so to speak. So you already think you're in a bad mood, and you think, I'm going to eat all this chocolate because it's going to make me feel better, but fine that at the end of it you're not going to feel better, and actually you're going to feel a lot worse. So the next thing to look at, like I was saying, your emotional responses and your triggers can differ, but there may be some situations that are going to cause you to binge eat more than others. So we've already talked about the feeling side of it, the stress and the tension. It happens so much. You know, people have had a bad day at work, they go home and they seek comfort in food or excess alcohol. The thing to remember here is that this becomes an addiction, that you really struggle to move away from this. Sometimes you might have a long period of time where you don't do this, but there's other periods of time where you just can't get away from it. So just be aware that it can come and go. So under eating is a common cause. Again, that can very much be linked to what's happening with the imbalance in your hormones, with your leptin levels, etc. Because of the fact that you're not eating, you're causing yourself to be overly angry, or hangry as you might want to call it, overly hungry, and you get to that point where you just will eat anything. Your body then starts to crave those bad things that you've gotten used to comforting yourself in, and you go and you eat it. So under eating, a good way to combat that is planning and preparing your food, and I'm going to talk about that in the section where I talk about, you know, what you can do to maybe help combat some of your binge eating. Now, one of the things that comes up a lot is unstructured time. What do I mean by that? So often people can be sitting watching the TV, they're alone and they're bored, and that's where it comes under the term of unstructured time, because you found nothing to do. It's maybe triggering, you know, those feelings that we were talking about, and so one little thing becomes a big thing. Restrictive diets. Now, I work in the fitness industry, I work as a transformation coach. However, I work on a very holistic approach, and I work on basically what the human body should be ingesting, and not what we've kind of almost been brainwashed to do through modern day society with processed foods. And quite often when people don't understand that, you can be accused as trying to brainwash rather than actually accepting that there's a set way that the human body was designed to ingest food, and that we have various body types. And it's the reason that I really don't like these super restrictive diets that aren't food based. For example, they're shake based and that are pill based, because they're very much sometimes the thing that can lead to people going down this route. And it's why, as I said earlier in the video, that it was really important to me that when I decided to come back into the industry, that I was going to go and get official qualifications on the mental health side of it and how it works, because the two very much come together. And restrictive diets, well, why does that cause you to binge? Generally because some of them still allow you to eat a lot of processed foods. So on the days where you're not having those processed foods, your chemical balance can be off slightly because you've been eating these foods previously, and your body starts to crave it, and it's like going cold turkey really. And you want to eat these foods, and because it's been so restrictive, you're like, sod it, I'm just going to fall off the wagon and eat loads. And then those feelings of destruction come back in, those feelings of guilt come back in. Whereas learning a new relationship with food, and whoever's guiding you, actually teaching you about, this is a new relationship with food, this is actually what the human body should be eating, this is why we should be eating it, this is what it does to your body, and you really understanding that although we are all designed to eat specific foods, we all have different body types and different metabolic rates, and therefore what we eat should differ. Hence why some people can get away with eating copious amounts of crap and don't gain weight, and why some of us, if we did, would balloon. But that's why, you know, these diets where they're very excessive, especially ones that are only allowing you to eat shakes and starving the body, again is very similar to the under eating. If you're already an overeater, you've got yourself in that bad habit already, so there may be periods where you're going to eat a lot more than others. I have to say though, overeating and binge eating are two different things. Someone who overeats is doing it on a regular basis. Someone who binge eats is doing it all at once. It's kind of like yo-yo diet, and you're going up and you're going down all the time. So that's our concepts, just some of them. that are common for to cause binge eating, and hopefully they'll make some sense. And hopefully, if you're on one of these excessive diets where it's really extreme, you'll begin to realise why maybe actually sometimes you're having a binge. And generally, I find people that go on really excessive diets sometimes have issues with viewing themselves as well, because they're in such a rush to be different. They're in such a rush to lose all this weight that this gaining for this bad food comes back in. Whereas the ladies I work with, we work our treats back in, and we look at food very differently, and we work really hard on having a different relationship with food. So just in case you're wondering, well, you're a transformation coach and you're telling people what not to eat and eat, I do it in this very different way, and I like to educate the people I'm training as well. So hopefully we're getting some insight. So let's recap what we've talked about so far. So binge eating, emotional eating, secretive eating. It's where we very much look at two concepts. We look at eating food in excess, often in secret and out of the way of people around us because we don't want them to know. It's very much looking at the lack of control when it comes to food. It's looking at food for comfort, and it's looking at those foods that already cause us our bodies distress, those processed foods, for that comfort. It's looking at the feelings surrounded by pleasure and comfort when we go to have a binge or we eat secretly, followed by feelings that are the exact opposite, feelings that don't pleasure us at all, feelings of disgust, feelings of shame, feelings of guilt of what we've just done, particularly if we're on one of these extreme diets. We are also connecting it to the basis that generally people who are doing these things are struggling with their self-esteem and their self-worth, and they're struggling with their confidence. It's very much a mask for them. It's a hidden mask. A good way to sometimes look at this is often girls who wear a lot of makeup are judged. And I often say to people, well, actually, they're wearing that to make themselves feel better. They're just not hurting themselves in the process. You can very much see how the two can be similar. We judge each other on everything, and sometimes we should step back and think about it a bit more. But just remember that the feelings are very much connected. Often these feelings are connected somewhere back in our childhood. I'm going to talk about how that might be very soon in the next half of the video. Also, what often can happen is we are doing this to get away from our world, from the stress in our world. But we recognise at the end of the day that it's something that is not benefiting us, it's not getting us any further forward. And I suppose the next step is what can you do to help yourself if you're really looking to get out of the rut that you're in, if you're really looking to get out of whether you're constantly binging or it comes during tougher periods in your life, and looking at, why is it I'm doing this? And I'm not saying you're going to get all the answers from a video, because I'm a big believer in having a professional talk you through and help you through these things, but it's not always accessible to everyone. So hopefully this next video on part 2 will help you look at some of the ins and outs and what it is you can do to help yourself when it comes to binge eating. And also hopefully it will take some heed and maybe make you look at some of my videos that I've done on self-esteem and building your self-esteem.